So why don't we meet this? If I'm speaking to my phone, can you folks hear us well if I'm talking on the phone? Just type yes or no. I can hear you clearly. Awesome. You know what? I'm just gonna leave my phone next to you.
Okay.
So I think that'll just be best. That'll be easier.
Great.
Awesome. Okay. For now, I'll hold it to make our lives easier. So I can also read what I wrote. Anyway, let me pull that up. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. The long version of peace be upon you, but may the peace, blessings, and mercy of Allah be upon you all. My name is Lulu, and I'm very proud and honored to be with you guys today. I'm the president of the Black Muslim Collective at UBC. It's a relatively new club. It's added to the list of new acronyms for you guys to remember. If you so choose, BMC, don't forget it. And we are very privileged to be collaborating with the CCMS yet again. So Sabah had to run, but she has definitely been instrumental in getting us onto really cool projects like these. So the goals of the BMC, since it's pretty new, so we'll kind of walk you through that. The BMC was originally created to serve the needs and address an inequality that Black Muslims have been facing within Muslim spaces. So that was the original intention. And even though we have always been in active pursuit of fighting anti-Blackness, not only within Muslim spaces, but externally, we have always had non-Black and non-Muslim allies be a part of our group. So we started in 2020. Oh my God, it's been 2 years. We started in 2020 just before everything hit the fan. And we're really happy to be continuing today. So we're a Muslim club that always prioritizes social justice, and that includes all aspects of social justice. Beyond just serving Black Muslims, we serve all Muslims living within the margins, within our community and outside of the community. So all walks of life, we are there to be on the forefront wherever our tools are necessary to aid in, again, pursuing justice. So we take a lot of inspiration from the Holy Quran, the book that Muslims, of course, turn to anytime we face any sort of adversity. And there is a verse in chapter 4, verse number 135 that says, in the name of Allah, stand up firmly for justice as a witness to God, even as against yourself or your parents or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor. So that is really what the club is all about. So as much as we fight for justice, we're also a club that brings students together. Our goal is to make sure that people can network with one another, to connect with the community, to have fun. And beyond all of that, we serve Allah, and we make sure that we do things to His pleasure. So doing right by one another in the context of social justice or beyond, that is at the end, the goal of our club. And we also take even more inspiration. It's hard to pick a verse that's my favorite, but this one I think speaks to all of that. And it asks the questions, can the reward of goodness be anything other than goodness? So be good to one another. That's the point of the BMC, and we do so in multifaceted ways. So thank you to Esma for the brilliant acknowledgement. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to CCMS. I don't know if you guys are on screen, but what's up? And I'm happy to turn it back to you. Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum. Oh, right. Yeah, here's my phone. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, okay. So it's muted on there. Mic, I guess, disconnected there. Awesome. Okay. So thank you. That's a little bit about the BMC. This event is also put on by CCMS, another acronym, Center for Comparative Muslim Studies. So Sabah had to run out, but Sabah's been really helpful in organizing this. Also Dr. Tamer as well, who's here, who helps put on academic and public discussions about Muslim societies and in all their complexity and plurality. And it's a very great group. I suggest following their Instagram page and their newsletter, keeping up with events. They also have a YouTube channel with all their past lectures that are very interesting if you want to watch them back. This event is also put on by the caucus. I'd like to ask Parsa, a member of the caucus, to come say a little bit about the caucus, introduce it to us. Our mic, yes.
Okay, cool. It's my little mic. Okay, this is the microphone, I guess. Well, welcome everybody. A few words about the caucus, our purpose and our composition, I guess. Asma and Sabah both being members of the caucus as well. More or less, it's a learning community. But we figured out over time, spending time in the colonial institution, academia generally, we noticed that it had a propensity to suppress a fundamental aspect of education and learning, which was liberation. Could you seek liberation through education using colonial institutions, using what is essentially an apparatus set up to, let's say, make it very difficult and make a lot of avenues so opaque that, aspects of liberation that are mentioned through theology, whether it's through the Latin American tradition or the Islamic tradition, that there is a propensity when educating yourself, when being a part of a learning community, and Muslims can be concerned with learning and peace, that one would have to seek liberation if one is seeking education in the sense that it's not alienating, that there is a direction and purpose to education, that when we learn about, let's say, what's happening in Palestine or international relations or philosophy or theology or even biology, that there's a purpose to it. It's teleological to an extent. And when we do this, when we approach education, approach these topics together as a community, that we pursue dialogue, not lectures, that we pursue, rather than an authoritative relationship between people and instructor, we have a coordinator, a guide essentially, a facilitator maybe, and a round table almost, that we have not only much more passion towards that pursuit, but we are much less alienated. And there's much more effect to our pursuit in general. And that's what the caucus is about. Every member of the caucus, they bring in insights, they bring their own passion and energy. And it helps us, investigate everything happening from Western Sahara to Palestine to Iran, and so on and so forth. And yeah, we always take on opportunities to collaborate with other organizations and community members who follow the same vision and goal. But yeah, I feel like I'll stop right there, keep it succinct. So yeah, that's a bit about the caucus, and we're always looking for community members. Most of our members are SFU and UBC students, graduate and undergraduate. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Farsa. That was awesome. Awesome intro to the caucus. And then now, last but not least, we have our speaker, Shahriz. Take it away. Give a little intro to yourself and get straight into the talk.
Oh, should I introduce myself?
Yeah.
Too? Oh, good. It's awkward enough, right? An introduction about yourself, let alone giving one.
To die on you.
Thank you. Okay. Hi everyone. Assalamu alaikum. It really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Asma who reached out initially to have this talk, and we were going to do it online initially, and then I was in the US until last night. Actually, I was at AAR, the American Academy of Religion conference, and then I thought, well, I've got family in Vancouver, so why don't I just see if I can come here and do it in person, right? Because I'm sick of attending stuff online and all of this stuff. So I'd much rather, with a topic like this, as you guys have already said, it's important to build those international relationships and discuss these things across boundaries, right? And see how I'm going to be speaking a lot about the British context today, of course, because that's my context, that's where I work, and that's where I do my research. But how can we adapt that to the Canadian context, for other contexts, and how do we build relationships in that way? So yeah, thank you. And thank you to BMC and CCMS. Those are the right acronyms. Yes. Okay. For inviting me and for facilitating this. So thank you very much. Should I introduce myself too? Okay, so my name is Shahriz Chaudhry, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. My supervisor is actually Shadab Rahmatullah, who is a Vancouver, not native, that's probably not the right word to use in this context, but he's from Vancouver. So he was very excited when he found out that I'm coming here and giving a talk here. And yeah, so as you can see, my topic is on Islamic Liberation Theology, and I'm particularly interested in the class and economic element of this. And there are many reasons behind that, coming from a relatively poor Muslim background myself, trying to figure out how does Islam speak to that reality. But also just from my intellectual development, I also became very interested in Marxist theory and third world Marxism in particular, and various people around that. So I wanted to be able to bring these interests together through my PhD. So that's kind of where I come from. I would have prepared an introduction, but I didn't know that I would give it. So, but it makes sense. But yeah, that's a bit about me. And so, yeah, we'll get into my, I hope everyone can hear me okay. Okay, and online everyone can hear me, is that, yeah, okay, good. Right, so yeah, my talk is entitled Muslims and the Class Struggle, How Islamic Liberation Theology Can Be Used to Tackle Economic Inequality. And so the way in which I'm going to structure this talk, so the first thing I want to do is to give a bit of theoretical background to what exactly liberation theology is. And so what I'm first going to do is look at the relationship between Marxism and liberation theology, which I think is fundamental, and hopefully you will see why. After this, I'm going to go into a bit of the history of liberation theology as a field, and some of the roots of it, so that we can understand some of the paradigms, some of the key concepts. After that, I'm going to go particularly into hermeneutics, so that's the interpretation, and how we can develop a hermeneutics of liberation, as I've termed it. And after that, I'll go into a bit more detail on my actual research on the class struggle in the British context. And finally, after that, we'll have a round of questions and we'll discuss it. And then after that, I wanted to have a group discussion where we all get involved together and discuss. I've collected some verses, some hadith, and from that we can discuss class struggle through our interpretation, our hermeneutics. So we're going to try and do some hermeneutical work ourselves as a group to try and understand these issues, so that we can, try and build this framework. And hopefully that's something that, as I've seen that you do your reading groups and everything. So it's something that hopefully we can all try and develop further. So yeah, without further ado, I'll go into part one, which is to look at Marxism and liberation theology. So as you all know, our world is made up of countless political ideas, right? And the question that then comes to mind is that why do certain ideas gain traction within our world and become popularly accepted, while others do not? So if we use Marx's theory of dialectic materialism, Marxists would argue on the basis of this that the reason is that the material reality in which we live, and particularly the class structure, determines the manner in which we think, who is able to create knowledge. And so because of that, ideas need to be seen within a wider social context and within a totality, right? Within a totality of power structures and conflict between different interest groups, between different classes, and between different hierarchies. And I think while Marx's ideas are very important, and this foundation is very important to understand, Gramsci's idea of hegemony is also, I think, particularly important, something that we need to get into. And of course, there is a lot to say about these theorists, right? I could come here and give a lecture on Marxism and take up 2-3 hours, but I'm just obviously simplifying it and going over it very briefly so that we can get into the liberation theology side of stuff a bit more. So yeah, Gramsci's idea of hegemony is also very important. And what he tried to do was understand why, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, revolutionary movements did not succeed elsewhere in Europe, right? And rather, these were actually undermined by the rise of fascism, both in Germany and also his native Italy. And what Gramsci was able to understand through this was that the ruling class used elements of the superstructure, i.e. culture, morality, ideas, and religion to manufacture consent, right, for the status quo, for the way things were. And that was even amongst, and especially amongst people that had more interest in things changing, right, in change. They were able to manufacture consent amongst these people so that they didn't want change, or they didn't think change was necessary. And so through this process and through this hegemony, the ideas of the ruling class became naturalized. And in that sense, became common sense, as it were. So our common sense is essentially determined by who the ruling class are and what they believe should be the way we think about life. And an example one of my teachers gave me back when I was doing my master's, and I think it's really stuck with me. It's a very trivial example, but they said how if it's say 2 a.m. at night and you're driving down the road and there's no one else there, we still stop at a red light, right? We were joking earlier as me and my cousins, about how everyone here stops at the red hand, even when there's no one around, right? And everyone waits until the white walking sign comes on. And this is like a trivial example of how consent and how control is manufactured so that we are controlled even with the absence of a threat, right? It's not that we only stop when we see a policeman on the junction, right? We stop even when there's no one around. So this is just a trivial example of how Gramsci sees hegemony working. Right, and this idea of common sense, these ideas of hegemony, this is why it's very common for us to also see working class people or poorer people parrot pro-capitalist ideas, right? So, for example, how many times have you heard a poor person criticizing other poor people, right, for being, and differentiating between different groups of poor people? For example, the deserving poor, those who deserve help, and those who are undeserving. And this is obviously often very much racialized, right? So this is a very powerful example. Something that I would like us to bear in mind as we go forward, right? This idea that the ideas that we have are not, they develop within a particular social structure, within a particular context. And we need to understand that context in order to understand where we get the ideas that we get from. Right. So because of this understanding of the relationship between the superstructure, i.e. ideas, and our social reality, Marxists have traditionally been very skeptical about religion, right? So Marx himself, as some of you may have heard, he famously described religion as the opium of the masses. Engels himself, so often we speak about Marx and Engels sometimes gets forgotten about, and we just talk about Marxism, but Engels is obviously a very important character within this development too. And Engels was even more critical of religion, and more explicitly so, and he said that he saw religion as inherently utopian. And he said that it was detrimental to revolutionary movements, even when it was on the side of the revolutionaries. So these two founding fathers of Marxism, as you can see, were both very skeptical and very critical about religion. Liberation theologians, however, have challenged this belief, and they've tried to make an intervention here within Marxist theory. And often, again, there's who do we see as building theory? And often it's very much the few white men, right? So we don't think of liberation theologians making theory, we see them as applying theory, as it were. But they actually here were building on a theory and trying to bring it forward. So their work is also theoretical. And somewhat ironically, their critique was that the Marxist or Marx's interpretation and belief on belief in religion being the opium of the masses was against his own theory of dialectic materialism, right, as we've just gone through. And because it treated religion as an abstract reality, right, and they essentialized it. So they made religion into something that was inherently reactionary. And liberation theologians argue that just like other ideas in society, religious interpretation is similar and is influenced by the powerful and the ruling classes. And this means that the majority of interpretations that we will see and the ones that will be popularized will be reactionary. But an alternative revolutionary religion is also possible, as you mentioned, Asma. And I've kind of jumped the gun a bit here and put Ali Shariati quote up from the beginning, even though we're going to, as Asma said, we are going to go into Ali Shariati in a bit more detail. But I think this quote from Ali Shariati really sums up this alternative way of seeing religion. So he says, and I'll read a part of it, there has existed throughout human history a struggle between the religion of deceit, stupefaction, and justification of the status quo, and the religion of awareness, activism, and revolution. So as this quote, and as Ali Shariati says, and as liberation theologians have said, within Marxism and within our societies, we should not essentialize religion in either way. So religion can be both the opium of the masses, or it can be a source of rebellion against the status quo. And it is up to us to decide which side we take. There is no neutral interpretation. It either does one or the other. And it's up to us as individual interpreters and individual practitioners of religion to decide which side we are going to be on. Okay, so the next part, I hope that now the relationship between Marxism and liberation theology is slightly clearer. And I wanted to get that out of the way because it's a fundamental relationship, right? And Marxism obviously isn't necessarily as popular now as it maybe was in the 70s when liberation theology became a thing, and people have tried to separate the two, but there's very fundamental insight in terms of dialectic materialism is essential for us to understand if we're going to understand liberation theology. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to go into a few of the roots of liberation theology, right? Where do we get this term from? What does it mean? And as some of you might know, liberation theology originated in the 1970s, this term, liberation theology. And this was with, and of course we talk about Latin America, this is probably the more famous example is Latin America, but it's important to acknowledge that this term liberation theology was used by Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru at the same time as James Cone in the USA was also using that term, liberation, or the theology of liberation. And he was doing it in regards to Black theology. So the Black Power movement. And again, maybe there's a more racialized reason why we recognize one side and not the other. But it's important to note that in the 1970s, both of these groups, Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru and James Cone in the USA, were talking about a very similar thing. And if you look at their works, there's a lot of interesting overlaps, right? And in fact, it's very interesting because also they didn't know each other at this time, right? But they were coming to very similar conclusions, even at the very term. They both used theology of liberation in their work, or this idea of liberation. So that's just an interesting thing to keep in mind. And of course, these traditions I've mentioned, James Cone and Gustavo Gutierrez, they were both talking from outside of an Islamic tradition, right? Both of them being Christians. Its influence on our way of thinking as Islamic liberation theologians is undeniable, right? We can't say that this is something that is not, tainted is not the right word, but is not influenced by Christian thought. And there is, of course, plenty of overlap there, and it's not necessarily an issue for us and between these different Christian and Islamic currents of liberation theology. And so liberation theology, it developed within the Latin American context. And I'm going to go more into the Latin American context. This is something I'm probably more familiar with than Black theology, but it's obviously important to recognize both. The liberation theology developed in the context of severe economic inequality in Latin America and revolutionary struggle. And this would be in the 1960s and 70s, so post-Cuban Revolution in particular. And the founders of Latin American liberation theology, they argued that this poverty and this inequality that existed was the greatest challenge to Christianity on the continent of South America. And this was in opposition to, for example, European Catholic thinkers who are very much more concerned with the rise of non-religion, right? The rise of atheism. When in Latin America, this wasn't the main issue. The main issue was that, hey, we've essentially got this huge mass of poor people that are considered non-persons, right? Which is the term that is used, non-persons that are dehumanized by an exploitative capitalist system. And so these liberation theologians, such as Gustavo Gutierrez, they questioned how Christians could seriously be considered to be upholding the principles of their religion in this context, which went fundamentally against the message and actions of Jesus. Gustavo Gutierrez, for example, argued that the whole climate of the gospel is a continual demand for the right of the poor to make themselves heard to be considered preferentially by society, a demand to subordinate economic needs to those of the deprived. So of course, capitalism was seen as inherently contradictory to this, right? And being a form of what they term systemic sin, which not only required and encouraged individuals to go against this message of the Gospels in their eyes, but also relied on this exploitation, right? It wasn't that they encouraged it, but actually capitalism could not survive without this exploitation. And so what then these liberation theologians encouraged amongst Christians and the bishops in particular in Latin America was to align themselves with the revolutionary struggles to achieve socialism in Latin America. And that meant working towards actual material change within those societies and elevating the status of the poor and essentially moving them out of their poverty. And this is a very important point to remember, is that Latin American liberation theology in its early radical epoch, it was very much attached to socialism. And it's not necessarily that it has to be attached to socialism, but what is important to remember here is the importance of attaching it to an actual historical project, a project rooted in actual material, trying to create material change. It's not about an intellectualization of this topic. It's not, hey, let's think about things through the eyes of the poor. It's about changing the status, the position of the poor. It's about material change. And that's something that I want us to keep in mind as we go forward. The next person that I want to focus on is Ali Shariati, who I believe you guys are actually reading at the moment for Religion versus Religion, right? So, and interestingly, again, as I spoke about Black theology and Latin American liberation theology, Ali Shariati was saying the same things in the 1970s, again, the same period in Iran. And he was very much involved in the revolutionary struggles against the Shah in the 70s, but died in 1977, so 2 years before the revolution succeeded. And it'll be very interesting. I want to talk to you about the religion versus religion, your opinions on this. I know me and Asma, we've talked about it sometimes on Twitter. So, but I think it's the reason I've picked out Ali Shariati, and I think there's plenty of other scholars, and Malcolm X is another one that people do definitely look to when it comes to Islamic liberation theology. But I personally, and I believe that Ali Shariati is the most important for us to study from an intellectual perspective in terms of the actual theory of liberation theology. Malcolm X is very important in terms of the praxis, right? In terms of how we practice liberation theology. But if we want to understand what exactly liberation theology is, I think we need to look to Ali Shariati. And so we already saw how Shariati argued that there was a struggle between the religion of accommodation and the religion of revolution. He outlined several paradigms that I wanted to just outline here that exemplify this struggle and this tension. And I think the most significant is the paradigm of the historical struggle between Cain and Abel, right? So for those that don't know, Cain and Abel are both the sons of Prophet Adam. Cain kills Abel, and he argued that, and the Quran mentions this event. And what Shariati argues is that the Quran does not mention this event only as a condemnation of murder, right? It's not just to condemn murder, but it's to outline the essential conflict that exists throughout history. And he describes it as such. And I'll read a part of this quote. And I think I don't necessarily like to read very long quotes out, but I think this is a very important quote so that we can understand this. So he says that the wing represented by Abel is that of the subject and the oppressed, enslaved by the system of Cain, the system of private ownership, which gained ascendancy over human society. The war between Cain and Abel is the permanent war of history, which has been waged for every generation. The banner of Cain has always been held high by the ruling classes, and the desire to avenge the blood of Abel has been inherited by succeeding generations of his descendants. The weapon of Cain has been religion, and the weapon of Abel has also been religion. So this conflict, which he says manifests throughout history, was seen in conflicts between other groups within history too. And so I've just taken here on the slides, I've just put up a few of those examples that he gives. So he talks about the conflict between two companions of the Prophet, Abu Dhar and Uthman. And he argues that the former, Abu Dhar, represents the true religion of revolution, while the latter, Uthman, distorted religion to support the wealthy and the powerful. The same conflict again was seen between Imam Hussein and Yazid. And in his view, the historical role of Shiaism as resistance, what he terms as red Shiaism, and the institutionalization of Shiaism under the Safavid Empire in Iran, what he termed black Shiaism. A second insight that Shariati shared on the Islamic worldview, and it's in a similar way to Latin American theologians, was the centrality of the people. For example, he shows how the Quran constantly puts the people in opposition to the rich and the powerful. So the rich and the powerful are not considered amongst the people. They are something, and they're a separate class, they're a separate entity. And God, within this dynamic, he explicitly often takes a stance in favor of the people, right? And one surah that we most of us will know is the Surah An-Nas. Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas. Say, I seek refuge in the Lord of the people, in the Lord of An-Nas. And he goes into some interesting interpretation of what exactly An-Nas means, and into this surah, which is very unique in comparison to what some other most tafsir would give you, or most interpretation of the Quran would give you. Right, so this identification with the people was used by him to outline the theoretical paradigm of Tawheed, which he argued was not just this theological idea of God's oneness, but a holistic way of life. The system of Cain, which was the system of the oppressor, as he says, that has dominated history, was not just oppressive, he argued, but a form of shirk, a form of polytheism. And this was because it created social divisions on racial, class, and gender lines. So it went against this essential idea of Tawheed, of unity. And the system of Tawheed, on the other hand, which he identifies with the system of Abel, would replicate God's unity, this oneness of God within society. And this was done by removing all such divisions along racial, class, and gender lines. And similarly, this true Islam, he argued, acknowledged both the spiritual needs of man and the material needs of man, and looked to secure both of them, right? So in this sense, Tawheed is very important as not just a paradigm or a theoretical paradigm for our spiritual relationship with God, but also for our relationship to each other and our relationship to others. And moving a bit away from Shariati, I think another important theoretical paradigm for us to consider is what has been developed by Farid Essaq, who is another liberation theologian. I think you're also reading him. You guys are going through a lot of reading while you're here at uni, which is very good. I never did any external reading from what I was forced to do, so that's very nice to see. But Farid Essaq, he develops this paradigm through the story of Exodus. And this is, of course, also a very prominent theme within Christian liberation theology. And the Exodus paradigm, according to Essaq, is a powerful illustration of God's active involvement in history on the side of the oppressed. As God in the story in the Quran, he continues to aid the children of Israel in their struggle against Pharaoh. And he even overlooks their disbelief in this period, right? Or their ungratefulness, as he calls it, throughout this period because they're oppressed. And while the reliance on this story of the Exodus has been criticized by some, so Shadab Rahmatullah, for example, does criticize the use of this because of the fact that it plays into some sort of Christian normativity, right? I think that is also important in its own right for us to consider as a paradigm, particularly in regards to how God very explicitly takes the position in favor of the oppressed. And after, when we have our discussion later, I'll be interested in hearing some of your thoughts on other possible paradigms we could use from within the Islamic tradition that we could use then as a theoretical foundation from which we can build a liberation theology, right? So how do we go about this task of developing a theology of liberation? And what are some of the interpretive techniques that we can use? I think the first thing that we need to clarify in this regard is what is the objective of our interpretations of the Quran, right? And rather than this interpretation being an end in itself, i.e. a way to discover some sort of correct or objective interpretation of verses through some sort of process of logic and rational reasoning. From a liberation point of perspective, the interpretation is the interpretive process is a means to an end, right? And as we saw within liberation, Latin American liberation theology, the objective is actually to change the material conditions of the oppressed and downtrodden members of society. And again, going back to Shariati, and if you note that a lot of the quotes I take is from On the Sociology of Islam, which is probably one of his longer texts, and I think is really, really fundamental. So maybe something that you can all read after. Maybe your next reading can be this one. And in this book, Shariati says, the inevitable outcome of history will be the triumph of justice, equity, and truth. It is the responsibility of every individual in every age to determine his stance in the constant struggle between the two wings and not remain a spectator. So basically what is important to take away from this is that what exactly are we what is this liberative hermeneutics of liberation? We are not saying within this that we are going to some very objective form of knowledge, but rather we are trying to use this knowledge. We are trying to use this interpretation in order to see how from within it we can then create change within the real material world in which we exist. So the next question then is, who gets to be involved in this process, right? Who gets to be involved in the process of interpretation? And although there is not really a unanimous agreement on this, I'm going to give you my argument on this. And what I would argue is that if Islam does not accept social divisions, right, this concept of Tawheed as a social paradigm, this means that marginalized groups themselves, not just the ruling class or scholarly class, have the right to interpret texts and they can speak to their own reality. There's no reason why they shouldn't be able to speak to their own reality. And there are plenty of examples I can give about this. In terms of the Quran, for example, you have Surah Mujadila, where a woman complained to the Prophet about something and God came and spoke to her, right? So it's an example of when people themselves are able to get involved in this process of the Quran and how to interpret what exactly it means. And additionally, as a result of this, right, it should not just be a purely academic exercise. And that means it can't be done within an ivory tower, right? This has to be done by people that are actively working on the ground to change the material conditions of people. And I think that precedent for this, and this is a verse that I'd like to highlight, is verse 2669, so Surah Ankabut, which I've put up here, which says that those who strive for us, we will surely guide them in our ways. And what this verse suggests is that guidance comes to those who strive, right? Jihad, those who strive. And that means that it's for those that are involved in praxis, those who are involved. So guidance is prerequisited on being involved in what you are talking about, right? It is not something that you just do abstractly sitting in a seminary, for example. And so in my methodology, I focus on this latter point, and I argue that Muslim activists have already engaged in a primary stage of interpretation before they got involved in the activism. So essentially, if a Muslim gets involved in some sort of activity against class inequality or economic inequality, they do so having believed that this is in line with my Islamic beliefs. And so that in itself is some sort of interpretation of Islam. And so what I then do is through some interviews and group discussions, I reflect on this with them, right? And I reflect on this in order to create a stronger theoretical foundation from which we can then inspire further action and maybe inspire it on create a more broad theory in terms of what I've termed the theology of class struggle. And so this is more of a cyclical process, right? A process of praxis that you can see here in the diagram. And this is again based on, for some of you that might know Paulo Freire, the Brazilian pedagogical worker. And he basically argued that praxis was a process of theory, was a process of action and reflection on the world. And so this is the hermeneutical circle, as it's called, that is created out of that. So theory inspires action, which is then reflected on, which creates another theory, which then inspires action, and so on. Right, so I hope at this stage we have quite a clear idea of some of the key principles of liberation theology. And I apologize, it's been quite abstract until now, but I think that this is very fundamental for us to understand some of these points before we actually get into the main topic of today, which is the class theology of class struggle, right? And so that's what I'm going to go try and get into now. And because of this focus on praxis, it is very important for us to understand the context in which a liberation theology takes place. And since the British context differs quite significantly from the Canadian context, I wanted to just outline some points for us to keep in mind as we then, as we get into it. Ben Okri, in a powerful poem, said, "If you want to see how the poor die, come see Grenfell Tower." Some of you may have heard of Grenfell. This was a fire that happened in 2017, so just over 5 years ago now, in West London, in the borough of Chelsea and Kensington and Chelsea borough, which is one of the wealthiest boroughs in the whole entire world, actually. And you can see an image of the burnt out tower here. And in this fire, at least 72 working class and mostly racialized people were killed. And I think that the reason I have decided to go into this a bit is because I think that this event, this fire really exposes some key themes about what defines modern day Britain. The first is the existence of a racialized working class. So in the post-war years, so post-1945, World War II, the UK imported large amounts of non-white labor from colonies or former colonies. So this is particularly the Caribbean or South Asia, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. At that time, Bangladesh was part of Pakistan. And while some of these took on professional roles, so some of them, for example, became doctors or lawyers, many of them worked in either declining industries such as textiles and mines, or were in the services and hospitality sector. And so due to a combination of government policy, and again, I'm very much just going over some very basics here because, people will write entire long books about what it means to be a non-white person in Britain, right? So I'm not going into the details, but due to a combination of government policy and systemic racism, the majority of these immigrants remained remain till this day in marginalized economic and social positions. And the constant dehumanization, both by politicians, by the media, has meant that subpar housing, social services, and healthcare provisions for these racialized communities can be justified, right? And in an extreme case, this led to the fire you can see behind me at Grenfell. And it is because of this dynamic and this intersection between race and class that Robert Shilliam, who is an academic, I believe he's based in the US now, but focuses his work very much on the UK, the British context. He says that race is class. There is no politics of class that is not already racialized. Moving, if you we have more questions on this, the context, we can go into that later. But the second factor that I think is worth noting is the rise of neoliberalism in the UK. And this, in the UK context, can be traced back to the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. And this followed global trends that saw the expansion of this so-called free market and the scaling back of labor rights and social services. And this was made even, and so after Margaret Thatcher, the following Conservative government, and then the Labour government, the new Labour government, and then now the new Conservative government that's been in power, they've essentially just continued to uphold this neoliberal framework. And I think that it became even more severe with the imposition of austerity politics post-2008, post the financial crash of 2008. And one noticeable example I'm going to just mention is the selling of public housing stock that started in the 1980s under Thatcher. And this meant that a basic human right, i.e. having a roof over your head, was sold off to profit-driven landlords and housing associations. And so in the Grenfell case, when there was a refurbishment of the outside of the building, this meant that in order to cut costs, the housing association installed flammable cladding onto the outside of the building, right? And it would have cost them something like £5 more per square meter to put the non-flammable cladding on. So the difference of £5 is essentially the difference between life and death here. And this meant that a small electrical fire that started in a fridge, I think on the 6th or 7th floor, shot up the outside of the building, shot up this cladding, and meant that the whole of it became a shell. And as I said, at least 72 people died. And the final thing I just wanted to say in terms of the British context is that British Muslims within this are overwhelmingly amongst working class communities, and therefore suffered disproportionately from a lot of these things that I've just spoken about. So, for example, 46% of British Muslims live in the 10 most deprived areas of the country, 46%. And around 50%, and this number is quite outdated, and the likelihood is that it's only risen, at least 50% are considered to be living in poverty. So 50% of British Muslims are considered to be living in poverty, and that is far greater than any religious group. So what we can see from this context is that British Muslims really have a personal interest in developing some sort of theology that speaks to their working class and poor condition. And I would argue that this has been lacking. So this brief context that I've gone over, and we're finally getting into the more applied liberation theology here, I hope. And a lot of what I'm going to speak about now is based on interviews that I've done with 3 organizations or activists involved in 3 organizations, one being Who Is a Sane, which I believe has a few branches in Canada too. And they do some anti-poverty work. For example, in London, they do a lot of food drives and a lot of healthcare related stuff. So that's one that I focused on. The other is Sufra, Northwest London. And this is a food bank based in what we call estates. I'm not sure what the equivalent word is, or a place of public housing, right, where the working class people live. They're based on an estate in Northwest London. And they started off as a food bank, but have very much developed into essentially a community organization working on stuff, for example, such as accommodating for refugees and building a community garden and doing local community education work amongst a very poor part of this London borough. And the final group is Nija Manush, which is a Bengali activist group also in London, And they basically work around issues such as gentrification in the East End, which is borders the city of London, which is the main financial hub. They work on gentrification and again, community education projects. And Nija Manouche itself, by the way, works on the Bengali community, which is the poorest ethnic group in the UK. And of course, 99% also Muslim. And so when I spoke to these activists, I found that an alternative interpretation of Islam started to emerge that really challenged the economic status quo. And many of them argued that Islam gives us the tools to navigate class inequalities as they exist today, but they move towards the ultimate goal of abolition of class and the creation of economic equality between all people. And so here are two quotes from two of my interviews that I think summarize this position quite well. One of my participants, that actually both of these people were at Sufra, said that I think Islam encourages a soft abolition. It puts the burden back in the hands of the people to take it that step further and abolish class. Another one of the participants simply said that Islam in its true form abolishes class. So how do they make their case? How do they argue that this, how do they support this argument of the importance of class abolition? And I think the two main principles that come out are the principles of justice and equity, which are seen as key tenets by Islam by all people, of course. But what these participants argued is that if God is on the side of the oppressed, then by extension, if we want to get closer to God, this requires us to work to remove the causes of that oppression. And they then gave, and I think two people that very much summarized this within our tradition that people cited, the Prophet himself and Ali, his cousin, or the first Imam or the fourth Caliph, depending on which angle you come at it from, but Ali. And they were seen as two very prominent examples of how religious figures embody this being on the side, this idea of Islam being on the side of the oppressed, and did it through their actions, right? The Prophet himself, for example, was known to distribute all the money he gained through trade during the day by the time he went to sleep. So he would go to sleep without any money because he would have distributed it amongst the poor throughout the day. Ali, at the time of being the Caliph, for example, he used to go out at night. And this he did not just while he was a Caliph, but before. He used to go out at night disguised, and he used to distribute food secretly to all the needy people. So much so that when he passed away, some of the poor people complained that they didn't have food, and they didn't know until then that it was the Caliph himself that used to come and give them food. So yeah, through these two examples, you're very much seen to embody this care for the poor and this ability, this desire to elevate their position, to remove the poverty from them. And this desire for equality is not just within these actions, but also seen throughout some of our ritual practices, right, in a more symbolic way. So, for example, in the prayer, and again, I'm basing this all, by the way, on what I've been what the activists have spoken to me, and I'm just putting it into my own words. So, for example, the prayer, right? When we stand next to each other, shoulder to shoulder in congregation, there's no differentiation between one or the other person standing in that congregation, right? It's not like the rich people get to go to the front, or of course there is on gender lines now. So this, and again, this would be something that is critiqued in this, but there's this idea of symbolic equality of all people. And then within the Hajj and death, there is another example of this, right? Where during both of these things, during the pilgrimage and at the time of death, everyone is required to wear the same clothing, right? So when you go for the Hajj, you wear just 2 bits of cloth. When you pass away, you're buried with 2 bits of cloth. So in this way, there's no differentiation. If you're in Makkah, in theory, again, at least, I mean, obviously now you can stay in a 5-star hotel next to next to the, next to the Kaaba, or you could stay a few miles out in a 3-star hotel, or some people are sleeping on the streets. And now obviously things are changing. But in terms of the actual ritual practice, no differentiation is made. In theory, you should be able to tell whether someone is poor or rich as you walk past them during the pilgrimage, and again at the time of death. So Shariati, as I keep going back to, he says that, speaking of the Hajj, he says that when you make the pilgrimage to God, you must leave the palaces of power, the treasures of power, and the misleading temples. So you must leave all of that. And this is from his book Hajj, this quote. He has a book on Hajj, which is a powerful book. He speaks about this. But of course, if I leave it to this interpretation, if I leave it to this very grand idea of the abolition of class, we're speaking in quite a utopian way, right? We're speaking about something that doesn't exist today. And it's like, okay, great, right? Okay, so what does that mean for us today, right? Okay, Islam believes in this happening, but that's not what exists. So, okay, we say we don't live in an Islamic society. But as activists, what these people then did was they recognized that the real inequalities existed within the society in which we are. And so there needed to be some sort of action within the now that guided us towards these ultimate goals. And the three I've chosen to focus on, and again, there are plenty of others that we can speak about that have come up, but these are some of the three key themes, are the themes of compassion, giving, and struggling for justice in particular. And so the foundation for a lot of people, and it's very interesting to see this verse, Surah 5, verse 32, come up several times, right? This came up several times amongst the activists. And particularly this part, that whoever saves a life, it is as though he had saved all humankind. And several of the activists, what they said was that this shows how valuable compassion and how helpful helping others is in God's eyes. Another activist mentioned the hadith in which a prostitute was forgiven for all her sins for giving water to a dog, right? Which is a seemingly small act. And as Ibn Qayyim, who is a 14th century Islamic scholar, said, if Allah had forgiven one who gave water to a dog suffering from extreme thirst, then how about one who relieves the thirst, satisfies the hunger, and clothes the naked? So again, you see how here there's a similarity between the interpretation of some of these activists and our tradition too, in terms of like what a 14th century scholar is saying. And as these examples show, this compassion is not something abstract, right? It's not something abstract, but it's something that manifests itself in actual action. And several of these activists emphasize the act of giving in particular. And I found it very interesting to speak to them and to speak to them about what exactly this giving means, right? Because we all give, right? The idea of charity is not something alien to Muslims. For example, if you speak about the UK context, the Muslims are generally known to be the most giving of any religious group. But several of the activists again emphasize this act of giving, and verse 392, Surah 3, verse 92, came up again several times. And it says that you do not attain righteousness until you spend out what you love. And the hadith, again, that was mentioned several times, that none of you will believe until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. And what both of these emphasize is the importance of going above and beyond, right? You can't just, for example, give your zakat and that is it, right? Only once you can only attain righteousness if you give more than your zakat. And what this meant was that it's not necessarily just about the monetary, right? It's not just about giving some money to your local charity or anything like that, but it's about giving your time, giving even your life, for example, right? It's about being able to give further. And that is a true righteousness. And for example, one of the participants, as you can see up here, said that, okay, you chuck your crumbs, you pay your legal obligations, but that's not doing anything good, right? Good is when you go beyond this. That and this was a very interesting part as well. I was with him for like 3.5 hours. But it was a very interesting conversation. And what he was basically arguing in this was that he was very critical of a lot of people from the Khoja community that he lived in, which is in the UK, at least. I'm not sure what it's like in Canada, but it's a very wealthy community. And he was saying that a lot of these people, give us loads of money. They give us loads of money, but you see in them the way they do it, that they kind of they do it to make themselves feel good about it. They don't do it to help the people. They feel good about it so they can go about making more money, right? That is their objective. And he was very critical of this because he was like, what are you doing? Where are you on the ground when it comes to actually helping these people that you're supposedly helping? And he basically said that this was a way in which these people, these Muslims, pat themselves on the back for doing the bare minimum, right? And they're not actually dedicating themselves and their energies to changing the conditions of the less fortunate. And they argued that this went against the actual essence of giving, and it made it into an egotistical and selfish act. And of course, the hadith mentioned up here also implies working towards creating a more equal society, right? To love for someone else what you love for yourself requires some sort of is disinterested, right? You're giving it for the sake of elevating someone else to your status, bringing someone closer to what you may have. And so in this sense, a lot of these activists reflected, and I would encourage everyone to read this book too, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Many of these activists reflected what is Paulo Freire's belief on giving, right? So Paulo Freire says that true generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands need to be extended less and less. So here, Paulo Freire's critique of what is essentially what we see today in charities, right? This neoliberal charity model, which is very much about giving, but actually, are we critiquing those structures? Are we critiquing those structures that mean that giving becomes essential? Or are we feeding into it? Are we making sure that it continues to exist, right? And this is some of the paradox of charity sometimes, whereas their very existence, the CEO's $100,000 salary depends on the existence of poverty, homelessness, human rights abuse, etc. There's a paradox there. This brings me on to the final principle that I want to speak about, which is that these acts of giving and this generosity, right? These were not seen as isolated acts. They shouldn't be seen as isolated acts of things that are done individually, but they're part of, again, a broader paradigm, which is the struggle for justice and working to end economic inequality. And again, this is implied through some of the hadith and the verses that I mentioned before, which is that you can't really give from what you love or want for others what you want for yourself by taking an easy route. It requires some sort of struggle. It requires jihad. And the importance and the centrality of this praxis, this struggle, was emphasized through this hadith that was again mentioned by several people, which was that whosoever of you sees evil, let him change it with his hand. And then it goes with your tongue or in your heart. But especially the part of changing with your hand, and this being the highest form of piety. This emphasized the importance not just of words, but of actual action. And the story of Hussein, Imam Hussein, embodies this struggle, right? And shows the extent to which personal sacrifice and discomfort is required for us to work towards these wider goals. And in this regard, again, Shariati, he says that Hussein's struggle was a culmination of a movement to free the people and rise against the powerful, the wealthy, and the deceivers. Participants argued, especially, and again, this is obviously a very powerful motif within Shia Islam in particular, the Karbala and Ashura. Several participants, especially my Shia participants, they said that this remembrance of Hussein, or this event that happened, this should move us to change ourselves as individuals and our relationships to God, but also to work towards transformation of society. So this, and so in that sense, being a follower of Hussein, if you claim to be that, or the Islam that he represents, is not about mourning events, right? It's not about going in and spending 10 days in the majalis to mourn him, but it's about transforming yourself and what's around you. And in this sense, again, there's from the Iranian Revolution, there's a very famous slogan, which was that every day is Ashura and every place is Karbala. So this, again, this motif was very much there, this idea of struggle in every day in all your parts of your life. And so while none of these principles that I've mentioned, compassion, giving, or struggling for justice, they're not particularly controversial themes in themselves, right? You could argue that you'd find very few Muslims that would disagree with this, right? You'd find very few Muslims that would say, yeah, we don't believe in justice. We don't believe in giving. But what makes these revolutionary, what changes these, is this attachment to the wider paradigm of abolition of class and the creation of equality, economic equality. And what I would argue is that this broader framework is what gives these more micro level principles a revolutionary character and gives it something that is challenging to the status quo, right? And again, I would come back to this comparison between the neoliberal form of giving and charity and the form of giving that is described by these activists. And is that this attachment to the goal of abolition that I think gives these principles a new meaning and a new direction. So just to conclude, I just wanted to bring together a few of the key points that I have spoken about, and hopefully after this we can have some questions and some broader discussion. Liberation theology, it provides us with an alternative way of interpreting and thinking about religion. And the essential important point is that this is a form of religion that does not claim to be unbiased, right? It doesn't claim to be objective. It claims to be there for a particular purpose, which is to change material conditions of marginalized and oppressed groups in society. And of course, I have spoken about class, I've spoken about economics, but the same can be extended to race, it can be extended to gender, it can be extended to settler colonialism, as for example, Shadab is doing in his recent work. It can be extended to all other forms of marginalization that we see in society and the intersections between them. So even like in my own work, I tried to bring in race and gender too. And I mentioned race earlier too, in the context part. So it's about changing material conditions. That is the important thing that we need to take away. And the paradigm of Tawheed and the paradigm of the Exodus, these are two concepts and ideas that we can use in our understanding of these, this imperative. And these two paradigms, what they show us is that God has a preference for the oppressed. He is very much on the side of the oppressed. And it is up to us to figure out how we can be on that side too, right? That's already guaranteed, as it were. It's about how can we figure out where we are on this journey of history, this struggle between Cain and Abel, as Shariati puts it. And finally, just on my research, just to conclude on that, is that these British Muslim activists that I've interviewed and who I've focused on, they have developed what I would argue is an alternative and more revolutionary interpretation of Islam. And this argues for the abolition of class and the creation of economic equality within society. And this can be done in the here and now through reinterpreting what compassion really means, what giving really is, and through this broader paradigm of struggling for justice. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for being here, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and having a broader discussion afterwards. Thanks.
we're setting up a website for folks online to log in and
Okay.
ask questions. The other option is for people who are more than welcome to unmute themselves and also speak, but you'll probably just, you can either choose to do it from my laptop, but it's gonna be annoying. So using my phone, just unmute and put the volume up from there. That's easier.
Right.
So anybody will let you know if anyone wants to speak.
Okay.
But also,
So yeah,
until
anyone in
now,
this room.
yeah. Question up there.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I've attended how to spread culture in Africa. One of the things we emphasize is the role of politics, of course, in the struggle for liberation, and also the whole issue of greed, because he was very involved in the leadership program and challenging the status quo through education. My question is, what role does greed play? Because you can't, greed survives on charity. You didn't mention anything. These days, there's a lot of talk about greed in the ruling class and also democratic socialism and so on. Can you mention how does Islam deal with greed rather than poverty exclusively?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just repeat the question for the people online. So the question was about what is the role, how does Islam deal with greed as a,
Without exclusively dealing
with,
with charity.
yeah, rather than just exclusively dealing with poverty and charity. So first off, what I would say is that it is important for us from a liberation theology perspective, at least, to not fall into this trap of saying, what does Islam say? And the reason I say that is because, as I said, we should not essentialize Islam. What does Islam mean? And obviously, I'm sitting here arguing that what I am saying to you is what Islam says, right? So there is that paradox slightly, but I'm not saying it that this is an interpretation of Islam, right? So it's not Islam, what Islam says, and therefore, because Islam can mean so many different things to so many different people, right? So it's important not to essentialize it. But to answer your question in terms of greed, I'd go back to this slide here. Yeah, so I'd go back to this slide here on giving, right? And I think you're completely right that greed plays a very important role when it comes to charity, right? And this paradox. And I think that what a lot of my participants spoke about was that you can't, and this is where their critique of a lot of other members of the community came in, and other interpretations of Islam, which were basically saying that Islam is okay with you making as much money as you want, as long as you give charity, right? So whether that's charity or that's zakat, they were very critical of the idea that that means that you are no longer complicit, or that's you're beyond sin, as it were, because you've given some money or you've given your 2% of zakat, right? What they said that was that this greed on a personal level was part of this broader systemic issue of capitalism, was part of this broader issue in terms of, if you are greedy within this system, you are complicit in the poverty of others. You are complicit in the fact that because you are rich, other people are poor, right? So a lot of them did use this quite Marxist critique of the relationship between being rich and being poor, the two not being separate from each other. So greed, I would say, was very much within that paradigm. They saw greed within that. So going back to the idea of systemic sin from Latin American liberation theology, systemic sin argues that the sin is not just an individual thing, but it's part of a broader system of sin. And so greed should be seen in that dynamic too. right? Greed is not just a personal issue, but a systemic issue. But I take your point in terms of like the importance of actually developing a critique of greed in a more concrete way. And I think the activists do very much do that. And I think we can definitely cite many examples from the Quran, which I think I do in the discussion actually. So we probably will have this discussion in a bit more detail in there, where we will speak about that, about how does God exactly treat how does he treat with the rich in the Quran? And you'll see that often it's very critical. It's a very critical response to greed and to wealth. So that's something preliminary thing I'll say, but hopefully in the discussion, we will get into that a bit more.
There's actually someone on Zoom, so if you want to unmute or put the volume on me and
Assalamu alaikum, can you hear me?
It's quite quiet. Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me again? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I have two questions. So I've recently joined sort of a Trotskyist Marxist society recently, and I've, naturally when I met a lot of the other Marxists there, the vast majority are atheists, and I do discuss the issue of religion with them. And I think the response that I've been sort of getting is I guess Islam is sort of treated as like a coping mechanism, and for them, they see Marxism as obviously coming from a materialist perspective and religion as idealist. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about idealism and Marxism. And with that as well, could you talk about maybe the function of Islam within, say, a classless, stateless society? And the second question is about mobilizing Muslims here in the UK. So I'm sure you've heard of like the Brunswick strikes, where you have, South Asian women who mobilized, even with a lack of understanding of like trade unions. And so I don't think it's impossible, but when I interact with, say, other working class Muslims, the idea of like revolution or liberation theology is so distant. So I wonder, is the approach now, is it now sort of an individual learning theory kind of journey that we need to take? Or, I'm even thinking like, is it the responsibility of imams who give khutbahs? And yeah, I just wonder what your thoughts are about mobilizing. And yeah, great talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I repeat the question. So the first question was more of a theoretical one about how do we approach this as Muslims within a Marxist context, because Marx is often very critical of religion, right? Marx is often dismiss religion, as we spoke about earlier. So how do we engage with that, and what would be some responses to that? And the second question was about, so I believe the speaker was based in the UK, which, thank you, I think like, it's at 2 a.m. there, so I really appreciate you staying up to 2 a.m. to listen to me speak. But it was the second question about how do we make this into a mobilizing technique? How do we actually mobilize people on the basis of this? Because there's quite a lot of passiveness when it comes to these issues. So on the first question of dealing with Marxists, this is a difficult one. It is a difficult one for sure, because I think you will have a lot of Marxists that do dismiss you if you try to bring religion into your politics, right, and into a Marxist framework in particular. And partly I would argue you don't need to argue with them, right, because a lot of it depends on who your interlocutor is. Who are you speaking to? Right? Who are you trying to speak to? Who are you trying to affect with your work? And on the one hand, you're trying to look towards the poor. You're trying to look toward the oppressed groups. And so to them, it doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or you're a Muslim, a Christian or whatever, because fundamentally, if you try to focus too much on, is this poor person a Muslim or are they atheist? You're kind of missing the point, right? You're missing the point about what the actual issue is. And the reality is that the majority of marginalized people, especially when it comes to class and economics, are probably religious in one form or another, right? Because the majority of them live in the global south. And atheism is not maybe as big there and popular there as it is in a lot of the Western world. So this is not necessarily the same debate, right? I think a lot of Western Marxists maybe miss this point. and miss this reality, because we often get very caught up in our Eurocentric or Western-centric frameworks. But I do think, again, there is some real critiques, and I think liberation theology does do a good job of this, of actually saying that, no, religion, the idea that religion isn't just one thing. Religion is, again, there's no denying that religion is something that can just be used to make yourself feel better about how terrible the world is. You can see very concrete historical examples of this, for example, right? In terms of how Christianity was taught to slaves in the Americas, right? They were taught that, hey, don't worry about this terrible stuff you're going through here. Focus on how, when you enter the kingdom of God, all this suffering will, be fine, right? You'll forget all about it. So in that sense, it was very accommodationist of oppression, right? And we can't deny that history. And Islam, there's the same history in a lot of senses. There's the same idea that, for example, within Shia Islam, for a long part of the history of Shia Islam, there was reluctance to get engaged in politics. And this is from the highest levels. And it's very weird for us to think about that now, because we think of Shia Islam as very revolutionary and very the Iranian Revolution and all these movements and all of this. But historically, it wasn't like that. Historically, it was very much like, hey, leave this. When the Mahdi comes, he will sort out the oppression of the people. And this, by the way, is a very mainstream view. This is not that, in fact, getting involved in politics, when Imam Khomeini said this in the early 70s, that was a very fringe view. So the real view was, hey, just leave that, leave the oppression. The Mahdi, when he comes, he'll sort that all out and we'll be happy then. So we can't deny the role that religion has played to make us feel better about stuff and about our oppression. But, as Shariati has argued, as liberation theologians have argued in other traditions, right, Latin America, the USA and everywhere else, it doesn't have to just be that. Again, we have to stop falling into this trap of essentializing religion. That is the fundamental thing. We shouldn't essentialize religion as definitely oppressive or definitely accommodations. It can be either of them, right? And there's no reason why it's one or the other in its essential form. So that was the first question. The second question was about, sorry, I just kind of blanked out and remembered that you're up at 2 o'clock. The second question was about how do you mobilize around these principles, right? And this is a difficult one. I do genuinely think it's a difficult one. And I think one thing to recognize when you are doing something like liberation theology is that you are always going to be going against the grain. And this goes back to what I was speaking about earlier in terms of dialectic materialism and Marxist ideas, because ultimately the reason these ideas are fringe ideas is because they're meant to be fringe ideas. And I remember saying this to a few people a few days ago when I was having a discussion with a few other liberation theologians in the US, that if liberation theology becomes mainstream, if it becomes the popular version of Islam, it means one of two things. It means either we've succeeded, right, in the sense that these systemic problems are now, we've got beyond them, or this is now becoming a real strong movement, or the alternative is that it's been co-opted. It's one or the other, right? Because the very point of ideas is to uphold the status quo, or the popular ideas is to uphold the status quo. So we can see this with other things like decolonizing, for example, right? It started as a very revolutionary thing and very much anti-status quo, and then every university was like, hey, yeah, we're about to colonize the curriculum. And suddenly it became very sanitized, right? It became just detached from any of its revolutionary core, right? It became something that you can just attach to anything. So I'd say the same, that for us, it will always be an uphill struggle. This will always be a difficult thing to do. So I think we need to take that reality into account. But at the same time, people are mobilizing, right? And I think more and more I see in the British context, I see a lot of Muslims starting to question why we are where we are. And I think it's important for us to build from that very small core and start trying to make it bigger and bigger. So I do think that the importance of these ideas, having these sorts of discussions, is central, but also, and here's where I'd emphasize the importance of praxis, is that when people see you being involved in their struggles, they become more in tune with what you believe in. They start being taken into account, becoming more interested in that, right? Because again, if you just talk about abstract ideas like, oh, my Islam says that we should not have class inequality, that's great, but what are you doing to make sure that's not reality, right? It has to be something based in an actual praxis, in an actual reality. So I think that what is important to answer your question is that we really make sure that when we have these ideas that we're trying to figure out ways to put them into practice to make this an actual concrete historical project we're working towards, rather than just these grand ideas we speak about in the university or something, right? It has to be more than that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, and thank you again.
We have a question online about what books, like great beginner books on Islamic liberation theology you'd recommend.
Okay, so I think anything by Ali Shariati is a good starting point, as you might. I mean, Ali Shariati, the books that I would recommend, if you want a very short read, Religion versus Religion is very good. If you want something slightly longer, then I'll say On the Sociology of Islam, which speaks about a lot of the things that Religion versus Religion does, but in a bit more detail. So for example, the concept of Cain and Abel, that is developed in a lot of detail on the Sociology of Islam. So I'd recommend that. Again, Malcolm X, anything on Malcolm X is something that can be, but again, that would take maybe a bit more exploration on your own personal part of how does this apply to us today. And then for Ida Sark, if you take his Quran, Liberation and Pluralism book, that's also a very important book. It goes through a lot of the theoretical themes, but also applies it to the South African context in which he was working, in which he still works. Other introductory texts. I think Shadab Rahmatullah's Quran of the Oppressed is a very helpful introduction to some of the key themes, and also speaks about in relation to gender. But I think especially the first few chapters of that, in terms of like a theoretical foundation, are pretty helpful. That's probably enough to get you through a bit, yeah. So.
Thank you so much for your talk. This was my first introduction to Islamic theology. Thank you very much for this, and also for introducing Ali Shariati, again, a name that I haven't read, and I would time with everybody else that's read this. So just a bit of context. I am from the Hotel community. I am an activist, but this I was an activist, and then I made lots of money, then I gave charity, and now I'm an activist again. So it's really good to be in this room with a bunch of activists as well, resonating with my past experiences. But kudos. Definitely, I find that there can be a lot of nasty comparisons when we are talking about each other. And part of that, I think, is a legacy of being oppressed and coming from a situation that we're coming from. A lot of the people that you talk to in your study, I'm guessing, were activists or bent on activism generally, right? And getting their perspectives from there. So I find that perspective, as you also said in your talk, is pretty generalized. I mean, you can't find, I don't think, a Muslim that will say, no, I disagree, right? But what makes that other person then special to step up and go? This is sort of one question. Because interior, I mean, there needs to be some intrinsic motivation. Are you on Abel's side, or are you on Cain's side, or where you're sitting, right?
Right.
So those are larger existential questions, which some of which you brought up really well. I don't want to ask around the British context if there are concrete examples of, say, some activists, some Muslims that then went back to their respective communities or larger communities or masjids or community centers, whatever it was, and started this movement towards praxis. So I used to follow After Asghari, I think, in the UK. I found his posts back 5-6 years ago fantastic. He was taking on the hierarchy of Muslim associations, people that were organizing and running the masjids, the associations, so on, the imams, and so on and so forth. Actually pointing out, showing up, asking questions, writing articles afterwards, posting them up. And he was getting quite a lot of following from the youth and other people that were interested. Young hijabi woman, also, putting out videos directly challenge, like in auditoriums like this, which was a university student, so a friend, and just made and really funny and smashing and just attacking the hierarchy that's at the center of our community. So yes, in a roundabout way, putting theoretical perspectives aside, can you talk more about that kind of praxis that you've seen in digital?
Yeah. Okay, so remind me what the first question was on the
I guess generally speaking, I want to hear more about your experiences, or you can say to us some examples, comparatives, just sort of descriptions of actual praxis between what's happening with individual Muslims who are activists, then coming home to roots, right? Coming back into their own masjid, their own community, their own centers, and saying, wait a minute, the way we are organizing as a community, the way that we are participating as a community is not adequate to how we should be interpreting our faith.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I'll repeat the questions for the people online. That the question was about how essentially we have how are these activists that are challenging these forms of religion or the mainstream view of it, how are they then interacting with their mosques and the religious institutions in the UK context?
And I'm not saying there's a burden on them to interact.
No.
I just want to hear some examples of
Yeah.
that kind. Clearly everybody does what they can. Right?
Of course. And I think you will definitely, you gave some good examples, and I think you do certainly have some people that do decide to go back to the community in that manner. For example, Who's Hussein has done a good job with that. Who is Hussein, who's probably the most well-known of these three organizations, at least on an international level. Some of you might have heard of this organization. Because Who is Hussein, what they really did and what their real ethos was that we want to take Hussein outside of the majlis, right? The majalis. We want to take him outside. And initially what they wanted to do was to essentially just educate people about him, right? That was the initial aim, but then very quickly it kind of blew out of proportion is what they said. They were like this kind of, it went out of control for them, right? And suddenly so many people were interested in it, and then they were like, okay, how do we make this into a movement, right? And that has very much influenced the Shia community. I've definitely seen that, because there is I don't think Who's Hussein can necessarily take all the credit for this, because there has been a more a push towards maybe a bit more engagement in social issues within the Shia community over the last 2 or 3 decades anyway. But Who's Hussein, I think, did it with the youth community, right? That they really wanted to get younger people involved and make this story of Hussein into something that was going to move us to action within our community, for our communities to get into involved in actual charity giving and actual action, right? And they've done a very good job of that, because they've definitely recruited a lot from within the mosques, right? So a lot of the people that you'll find involved in Who's Hussein have gone back, but I don't think that challenge has, and they've got support from amongst the hierarchy in terms of imams in mosques and everything like that. But I think that it's easier for them to do so also because they're not pushing the boat out too much, right? They're probably the least radical of my 3 case studies, right? And there's a reason for that I picked a spectrum of different activist groups. But I think for a lot of other activists, there's actually a real tension here between their traditional institutions and their own praxis. And I think there's a very important gendered element here to speak about too, because for a lot of women especially, there is a real tension with religious authority, right? And the reason for that being because of putting it in a straight, it's because of the reality of sexual violence and it being something completely ignored within the religious institutions, right? So what you will find is that, and what I found very interesting was during my interviews, I found that a lot of women were much more critical of religious institutions than men were. And I think that's a reality that we have to take into account, that for a lot of women, these institutions aren't a comfortable place, right? They're not a place that you can go and affect. In a lot of mosques, they don't even have a space for them to pray, let alone a space for them to then go and voice their opinions about, hey, this is the proper Islam, right? So there very much is a tension there. And I think for a lot of activists, and especially the women, there is that really big tension, and we have to keep that into account. And I think because of that, it's like, who is your audience, right? And again, I think for a lot of them, it's more individual Muslims. It's more trying to get Muslims on board rather than getting these institutions on board. Those institutions are seen as a bit of a barrier for a lot of them.
Can I just follow up? I agree, and I appreciate your answer. In the Canadian context, what I've seen is exactly because of that barrier, exactly because of the resistance towards they groups of people, collectives, that have chosen to go their own way, to set up their own thing. So we've seen the phenomena of women being ordained as imam and then leading congregations in the United States, also here in Canada. We've seen also the growth of LGBT communities who have been isolated now, have a place where they have institutionalized it, whatever, across Canada. They've normalized it. They've got a community going. And of course, discussions that would happen in any masjid are also happening in those spaces. So I didn't want to suggest that one needs to go back to the original place, but I was just interested in this, if there's any movement going back to see if there's any, shaking up that agenda. Because while you're here, I mean, just look into what's going on with the BC Muslims Association, BCMA, and the controversy that organization has had over the number of years, that even the current, as far as last year, issue of gender, issue of representation, so many other issues. Issue of breaking the law, because they're supposed to have a gender equal law. This is the BC law, and they are a society operating under the law. And consistently over years, even that's been pointed out to them. Somehow nobody the government hasn't had a complaint, or the government, I don't know. Talk about gender so much, but I'm just saying. So I just wanted to hear some of that coming from a context.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe we can talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say there's probably. Again, obviously, I don't know the Canadian context, but I would probably guess that there's a lot of similarity in terms of the pushback and the resistance. And obviously now you've got the Andrew Tate, School of Islam kind of, which is very much and I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but it's it very much does represent a broader issue, right? Where you have this conservative backlash towards some of the ideas we're speaking about, right? It's very much, and that very much will continue to exist. I would be very surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think it would never exist, because it's meant to, right? That backlash is meant to exist, and it will be the same. The context will be different. The individuals involved in it, maybe some of the dynamics, but I would imagine that it's very much the same across most contexts, right?
We're just checking the website, see if there's more questions, but until then, anyone have any questions?
Yeah, minor question, kind of theoretical, kind of historical.
Uh-huh.
And when we talk about Marx's remark on religion as opium for masses, opium in that context was not only, a recreational drug, it was medicine. And I think what you were alluding to consistently is that religion has a medicinal quality, especially when it comes to the exploited, its oppressed masses. A lot of consideration needs to be given to the historicized role of opium as a medicinal drug. And, I'm I'm thinking, you talked about, some form of directionality between Marxism and Islamic Liberation Theology, how Marxists had an effect, Marxist sociology had an effect on Islamic Liberation Theology. For example, Sharia studying in Sorbonne, in the same circle, translating
Yeah.
I was wondering, because there are examples of, for example, like you mentioned Gutierrez, his thought informed Sunuro Luminoso, the Incan socialists to an extent.
Yeah.
There was some interaction, some play back and forth between, some Maoists, let's say, and the Incan socialists in Latin America, and liberation theology there. I was wondering if you could identify, to an extent, a form of directionality where, because there are also third world socialists and Marxists.
Yeah.
We can talk about Western Marxists and their Orientalism and so on, and their fetishization of Islam and providing a ontological distinction. But what about, for example, the possibility, if there are historical examples, I'd love to know, of third world Marxism being influenced by Islamic liberation. There's a precedent there, and if possibly theoretically there might be a problem because Marxists might view medicine being used for itself.
Yeah.
Like a big problem. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just repeat the question for those online. Is there any historical examples of how Islamic liberation theology may have affected social movements in the Islamic world in a similar way to how Latin American liberation theologies have influenced some of the movements there? Would that be a good way to summarize it?
Specifically Marxism.
Marxist, especially Marxist movements. And I think you're very right to point out, and I hope I was able to do this to some extent, is that it's not a linear relationship, right, between Marxism led to liberation theology, because, as I said, liberation theology was always contributing to Marxism, right? So it should be seen as a cyclical relationship, right? And we often place one above the other, and that's in itself problematic because who do we center, right? And I think it's very important to know that Islamic liberation theology as a concept or as an idea of Islamic liberation theology is very underdeveloped. It's a very underdeveloped field in the sense that there are a few scholars working on it. And the actual term itself was pretty much started with Farid Assad, right? So Shariati did not speak of a liberation theology, right? He spoke in different terms. But the two examples that I would give is that Shariati himself had a strong influence on the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq. And that not being today's Mujahideen Khalq, but the historical one that resisted against the Shah. So during the 1970s in particular. And that was very much the reason, or one of the reasons for the foundation of the Mujahideen Khalq was because of they wanted to create a form of socialism, a form of Marxism that was also in tune with the religious reality of Iran, right? In opposition to something like the Tudeh Party, which also was the Soviet-aligned Communist Party, right? So I would say that is probably the most significant example I can think of off the top of my head of like this sort of liberation theology actually influencing a movement on a broader scale within the Muslim context in relation to actually creating a new form of Marxism, right? Or socialism at least. In a more broader sense, I would say that the South African example is probably the most prominent. Not so much informed in terms of Marxism, in terms of the Marxist movement. You did have Muslim Marxists in South Africa fighting apartheid, but you did have liberation theology very much influencing movements there to resist. They worked with the ANC, for example. They worked with the Communist Party. They worked with the trade unions, etc., etc. So yeah, I would say that that's probably another example of it affecting a movement. I wouldn't say that we have many other examples, to be honest, which to some extent probably marks a significant failure on his part, right? To actually affect movements, to create movements. But yeah, I hope that's helpful.
If not, we'll move on to the discussion portion.
Yeah.
We're running, it's 6:34, so hopefully try to wrap up by around 7,
Mhm.
if that's cool.
Yeah.
So we'll fix the.
So should we end the recording for the discussion?
Yeah, okay, let's.
Yeah.
There I go. Not like, I'm not here. Okay, recording.